and we separate in 6 things that you must to know before you have the victims. The first is the personal issues of the victims. What nationality, what language she speaks, gender, age, vulnerabilities, as Alana says, the security of the victim also, because you never know if the trafficker wants to hurt again the victim, the communication, the victim, because sometimes they want to talk very faster with the family, the social, the family, if they have children, the dependents, but also if you have a lot of victims, so you need to have personal to identify each of one. So also talking about the victims before, you need to be prepared with water, with food, to understand what allergies have the victims, the schedules of the food, so for giving the food for the victims, because it's not the same when we talk about in Trinidad and Tobago, the schedule to have the meals, and the other countries is different, but also the kind of food. A foreign victim eats a different things that in Trinidad and Tobago or other of the Caribbean. So also thinking about the shelter. If you have of the government shelter, or you have NGO to help, or maybe she has a family, or she or he have a family or some friends to help her. So maybe also thinking about host families, hotels, apartments. And also you need to think at the beginning about the health of the victim, the physical and the weight and the injuries, the skin, but also the psychological, if she's depression, and also if she's pregnant or she's with a baby with breast, and also if what kind of illness that she have or he had, the HBI and COVID-19, the addictions also, the drugs and alcoholism, but also the medicines that she needs or he needs at the time. Other part that you need to have before, to understand who are going to be the interviewers. So how many interviews do you need? And also the kind of the modality of trafficking in person is sexual exploitation, labor exploitation. So you need to understand that there is a very different kind of investigation and the attention. Legal identification too. So evidence in advance that you have, and what state, if she wants to stay in the country, or if she wants to return. But also it's very important the victim have for the beginning, the information of what is happened, because remember, you go and everything is new for her and is so afraid. So the person who gives the legal information and the procedure information is very important. And also you need to have the sensibility of the personal before have the victims, because if you have some person who doesn't like the victims, who wants to try to make awful to the victim, this victim needs to be closed. Also, you need to be legal coordination. So you need to identification of the victim. If she's from Venezuela, she's from Colombia, you have embassy or consulate in your country to have the primary identification. And also immigration regularization, sorry. We have countries who give a special card for the victims of human trafficking, who legal state in the country, but also labor regulation. And also legal representation when you have children. And you need to understand also if you have another investigation, or maybe the trafficker put a tip against to the victim. So you need to take care also about this kind of investigation. You need also coordinated with Interpol or alerts or coordination, because sometimes it's related together. The social work for the victims, and it's very important to have the agreement of the victims. Just to have the importance, the 6 things of the importance to identification of the victims is you have a reference mechanism, a unit identification with multi-agency and invite experts, but also this is identification. You need an identification protocol, Also, we recommend to have a victims assist unit for the follow-up and these kind of cases. Only working together, it's the better thing that you can have for this kind of investigation. Also, the recommendation for no revictimization, because you have a lot of activities to do with the victims, and you need to very take care of the victims and not have a lot of interview and not a lot of person talking with the victim at the same time. We need to take care very well to each of the victims, and remember, each of the victims is very different. So thank you so much for invitation, and if you have more questions about the victims and the attention, we are here to help you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Monasterio. That was very, very comprehensive, and I know that there's going to be a lot of discussion surrounding it. I'd like to now introduce another speaker, ASP Rodney Ellis, who is the head of the Trafficking Unit, Ministry of National Security in Antigua and Barbuda, and he will be dealing with how is prostitution a form of trafficking, and can a trafficked person consent to prostitution, and of course, just before he does that, he's going to tell us a little bit about himself and the work that he is currently engaged in. So, ASP Rodney Ellis, please.
Good morning, and thanks for having me. Yes, a police officer in the Royal Police Force of Antigua and Barbuda for the past 30 years. I'm a member of the Trafficking in Persons Committee and the Investigative Task Force. I've been in that position for over 5 years and investigated a number of cases with regard to human trafficking.
And we'll give them permission.
First off, I only have 3 minutes. First off, prostitution is illegal in Antigua and Barbuda. I should say that from the onset, and I believe it is the same in the other countries. But in the context of the human trafficking, it is a form of exploitation, sexual exploitation. And you have to look at it in that context. Persons, you cannot consent to prostitution. However, in the context of human trafficking, you are forced into that position to give consent. And if you look at the definition of human trafficking, and some keywords that I would point out: coercion, fraud, and deception. And I can speak from doing my investigation. Most of these persons are being deceived into coming to other countries in the Caribbean to work, promise of high-paying jobs. And when they get to that country, it's something totally different, where you have to pay fees and not receiving any payment at all as to what you have been promised. So these persons are now placed in a position that they have to find money to pay these traffickers. Hence, they are forced into the situation of prostitution. And some information received during the investigation, and these persons are promised, let's say, a hairdressing job that would make over 500 US per week. And you know, in some of our countries, that's really not so. And in particular in Antigua, it's not really so. So when they get to Antigua now, all your communication have been cut with regards to your relatives back home or even friends on the ground. And then you are placed in a position that you have to repay the fare, the airfare ticket. You have to now pay, you're placed in a position that you have to pay for accommodation, you have to pay for your meals, and those like. Now you're not receiving any payment. So you have to find money to pay these people. And if you don't pay within a particular time, then interest goes on. So now the only way out, and this is from information received from these persons, because they have been provided with male persons to commit the act. So they are pressured and forced into that position of prostitution. Hence, basically, that is what is happening with regard to human trafficking. Now, all communication cuts. Checks are being meted out to you from those traffickers. What can you do? and you are forced into that position of prostituting yourself. Ms. Wheeler make mention of those situations. When you don't have money to pay, you have no communication with your relatives, you have no communication with friends, you can move out on your own. Security around you. If you're receiving visitors, if you can receive visitors, and the visitor most of the time are the person who you're going to prostitute yourself with, you have to pay. So this is the kind of situation that we are actually seeing during our investigation. These are the type of information that we are receiving with regard to prostitution, form of exploitation, and this is what persons are using. I can go a bit further now, because some years back, now the traffickers are changing their MO somewhat. So the persons now are more freer to move out. However, the bills are still there. And in our country, it depends on where you're from. You cannot work unless you get a work permit. And now it's difficult based on their situation to get a work permit. So then again, you are still forced into that situation that of prostitution. As I mentioned earlier, it's illegal in the country. However, in the context of human trafficking, where the person was forced into that situation, and that's the key word, they are forced into the situation of prostitution. So I'm looking forward for the discussion with regard to that and to answer any question with regard to human trafficking or prostitution within Antigua and Barbuda. Thank you for having me again.
Very much, ASP Ellis. There's some questions being fielded already from a lot of the discussions from the panelists. I just want to advise the participants that certainly please present your questions in the chat, but we're going to be dealing with those questions after each panelist has a chance to give us a brief introductory presentation. And we hope to and expect very, very full participation at that time. So thank you very much for your questions at this time. Do keep them coming, but we're going to be dealing with those shortly. Next up, we've got Mr. Daniel Griffith, who is the coordinator of the Ministerial Task Force on Trafficking in Persons, Ministry of Home Affairs in Guyana. He will be discussing with us what crimes are typically, does one typically respond to that might warrant a closer look for potential victims of trafficking, and what are some of the indicators or red flags that signify the possibility of human trafficking. And just before he goes into that, he would also tell us a little bit about himself and the work that he does. So, Mr. Griffith, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Firstly, thank you, CARICOM Impact, for facilitating this program. Thank you, good morning, colleagues, and also panelists and participants. My name is Daniel Griffith. I'm the acting coordinator for the Ministerial Task Force on Trafficking in Persons. I would have been here for approximately a year and a half. Our primary role here, my primary role here, is to evaluate and monitor all policies in relation to trafficking in persons in Guyana. It's a multifaceted approach which comprise various agencies to deal with trafficking in persons in Guyana here. Now, my presentation will be brief. So I'll go into straight in terms of what are the crimes that we, in the context of Guyana, where we associate in terms of have a greater look to address trafficking in persons. Now, as most persons would be aware and familiar, the primary purpose is for exploitation. So what we find in terms of victims, we're developing a new trend in terms of drug trafficking, where some of the victims, alleged victims, are becoming mules, are forced to become mules to traffic drugs and so forth for drug pushers and arms traffickers. Those are some of the crimes that are associated. Also, we have here in relation, another trend that is developing is the operation migrant smuggling and human smuggling. Now, because of as you're aware, we're close to Venezuela, we have a lot of victims that are smuggled over the borders and subsequently become victims of human trafficking. Prostitution, while prostitution in Guyana is illegal, those are most victims. One of our primary purpose is sexual exploitation. So prostitution would facilitate persons becoming victims of trafficking. The operation of brothels also basically some establishments on what we call in this area in terms of how our interland areas are kaimus, same facilities that provided sexual services and entertainment services. Now, so as I indicated, my presentation here would be a brief. Some of the indicators, what you would basically look for in victims of trafficking in persons. For example, are they in possession of their documents, their travel documents, particularly migrants and also persons traveling overseas? We have that crime also here, the withholding of identification documents. Persons who are submissive and or fearful. Those are some of the indicators of trafficking in persons. In terms of children, access to education, they're limited to have social interactions. They're doing work where adults are expected to do. Children are involved. We've noticed that also another trend with child begging, where parents or guardians are forcing children to beg on the streets and so forth. So those are some of the indicators. Unpaid and very little paid work, and also physical abuse, being very fearful, and so forth. So with that being said, that does give a big synopsis. I know time is against us here. So just to give you a brief overview in some of the crimes and also some of the indicators to look for trafficking in persons. So thank you so much for this time offered.
Thank you very much, Mr. Griffiths, for your time and your contribution. Next up, we have Ms. Rosalind Borland, who is the Senior Regional Migrant Protection and Assistance Specialist at the International Office for Migration, the Regional Office for Central and North America and the Caribbean. She has more than 15 years of experience in international development and is currently Senior Regional Migrant Protection and Assistance Specialist at the Regional Office for Central and North America of the Caribbean of IOM. During her career, Rosin has specialized on issues related to the human rights of migrants, particularly trafficking in persons and health, as well as return migration and reintegration. She has led multiple global IOM projects in collaboration with the Gender Violence and Health Center of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, including the development of the Global Good Practice Handbook for health providers caring for trafficked persons. Previously, Rosalind's led IOM's work on counter-trafficking, voluntary return, and reintegration and migration assistance in Southern America. She has also been based at IOM headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. Rosalind holds a master's degree in international human development from the School of International Service of American University. Prior to working with the IOM, Rosalind was a freelance writer working with Médecins Sans Frontières. She is going to tell us a little bit about how has COVID-19 affected migration and trafficking in persons, and what methods do traffickers use to recruit their victims, and what are the common methods to recruit women into the sex industry. So, Ms. Borland, we anticipate your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, sir. Such a pleasure to be here with you today. Starting with this very complex question, at the start of the pandemic, what we saw in terms of how COVID-19 has affected migration was related to the measures everyone was taking in our countries around the world to protect ourselves. So with the travel restrictions, we saw barriers to migration And many people were stranded all over the world. In fact, we still have thousands of migrants stranded because it's quite complex for countries to organize flights, ensure testing and quarantine and all of the things that are necessary to keep people safe. So migration has been affected. And we are seeing that some people are resorting to dangerous means to either continue their migration onward or to try to get home. So some people are using the services of smuggling networks, which can be very, very dangerous. And we're also seeing these mixed flows, which are known as caravans, happening in a couple parts of the region right now as people try to continue migration or to look for a way to survive. And that brings me to the second impact on trafficking in persons and people in general. We know that these kinds of crises, like the pandemic, make things worse. They make people more vulnerable to being abused, to being victims of violence, and to being victims of human trafficking. So whatever vulnerabilities existed, whether that was poverty or discrimination or lack of jobs, these things are becoming worse all the time and in all parts of the world. So we see increases in vulnerability and increases in risk for people who may be trying to survive and therefore fall into the hands of these criminal networks. The other impact we see on trafficking is how the criminals are adapting. And many of the experts who are gathered here today can tell you more about this than I. But what we know is that when there are big situations or crises such as this pandemic, the criminal networks are very savvy. They adapt their methods. So we are seeing online recruitment increase. We're seeing online sexual exploitation increase. There's a general concern for online sexual exploitation of children, which includes trafficking in some cases. So these modus operandi are changing. We're also seeing delivery of some of these forced sexual services to homes. And so we're seeing the exploitation taking place not in the clubs where you would normally see it, but in private residences. We're also seeing an impact on those who respond. So all of these experts who are here today have limits in terms of their response to trafficking because they're also being impacted by COVID. How do traffickers recruit their victims? Well, we heard some from ASP Ellis, and Ms. Wheeler and others have mentioned this. Often this is about false lies, false promises, trickery. So people are told there's an excellent opportunity for a job somewhere else. It might be inside the same country, but it is often in another country. This information might come to them through social media, but oftentimes it's someone in the community, someone that they know, a friend of a friend or a friend of a family member who has heard about an opportunity. So it's very common for people to be tricked by being told that they're going to have a job in a restaurant or they're going to have a job in some other sector and then be forced into some different kind of activity. For women being recruited into the sex industry by traffickers, it happens in many ways. Similarly, they are looking to survive, and often these women will migrate somewhere trying to improve their lives. So we hear stories all the time of people who need to feed their children, need to pay for health services for their parents, need to want a different kind of job, are leaving a difficult situation, and they are tricked by traffickers offering them supposedly good jobs somewhere else. And so they go towards that work, whether it's been promised in a different sector, or sometimes these women will know that they're going into the sex industry, but then they're lied to about the conditions and they're forced into supporting an exploitative condition. So that's in a nutshell. I'm going to stop here because I really am looking forward to the discussion and the question and answer. And thank you so much for letting me be part of this distinguished panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Borland. Our next presenter is Dr. Jason Haynes, who is the Deputy Head of Graduate Studies and Research for the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill Campus, Barbados. Jason has previously served as Senior Legal Officer of the British High Commission, Bridgetown, Barbados, where he acted in the capacity of an international lawyer for the UK Crown Prosecution Service International Division. He's a graduate of the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus with first-class honors. The University of Nottingham, where he did his Masters of Laws with distinction. The University of Durham, where he did his doctorate in international law and comparative law. and the Norman Manley School of Legal Education certificate. He's an attorney at law, admitted to practice in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and Barbados. Jason's work on human trafficking has been cited by a number of scholars and international organizations, including the Council of Europe's Group of Experts on Trafficking in Human Beings and the Caribbean Community European Union Directorate. In fact, he served as a legal consultant at the CARICOM EU study on human trafficking in the Caribbean. He's the author of the monograph, Caribbean Anti-Trafficking Law and Practice, which has been well received by lawyers and judges globally, including Ms. Justice Maura McCone of the High Court of England and Wales, who has described the book in her review as a challenging intellectual workout and an invaluable guide to those involved in this area of practice as advisors, advocates, and judges. He's also co-author of Commonwealth Caribbean Sports Law. Jason has, in addition, presented at numerous conferences and seminars in the Caribbean, the United States, Europe, and Central America. And he has recently been appointed as a Trafficking in Persons International Legal Consultant for the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative in Barbados. So Jason would be speaking to us this morning about the low rates of prosecution in the region and the importance of legislation and areas for improvement for better prosecution strategies. So I invite Jason to please enlighten us by taking the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and good morning to colleagues all across the Caribbean and more generally globally. Thank you very much, CARICOM Impacts, for this opportunity to share my research and my thoughts in relation to the topic of legislation and prosecution as they touch and concern human trafficking. Now, the good news at the very outset is that the majority of Caribbean countries have adopted trafficking in persons legislation, which are largely compliant with international practices and standards, namely the Paloma Protocol against trafficking in persons. And I think that is a good starting point because it does seem to suggest that our region has made advances in the last several years insofar as the challenge, however, as you've rightly identified, is the relatively low rate of prosecution, which is not only an issue which confronts the more developed or lesser developed Caribbean islands, but countries globally. So this is a challenge which has namely the United States annual trafficking in persons reports, and of course, reports emanating out of Europe, out of the United Nations, more generally speaking. Now, in the Caribbean context, the question then arises, what accounts for the relatively low rates of prosecution in our context? Now, biggest contributor to them is that of the relation to the identification of trafficking persons. All right. Now, in many of our jurisdictions, legislation provide for the identification of victims of trafficking, but they're not specific enough in terms of the modalities of that identification process. Right? And so, therefore, if you have poor identification, then it means then that invariably the prosecution would not be in a position to have the appropriate evidence that is needed to advance the case against perpetrators. Say that once we improve the number of victims have been trafficked, there will likely be also an improvement in terms of the rate of prosecution. Now, even in circumstances where victims are identified, part of the challenge which prosecutors face globally and most specifically in the Caribbean context is the general unwillingness of victims to cooperate. Now, this is something which is a perennial challenge. It is something which really and truly is very frustrating for prosecutors. And I've spoken to a number of you, and they feel a sense of helplessness because oftentimes the victims themselves, as a result of not trusting prosecutors and investigators, as a result of Stockholm Syndrome, as a result of cultural barriers and matters related to language barriers, They simply are not in a position or simply don't trust prosecutors enough to provide the type of evidence which they need in order to advance the case against perpetrators. Now, you would imagine that in a typical trafficking in persons case, you would necessarily, as a prosecutor, need to have enough evidence to meet the evidential burden that is placed on your case beyond a reasonable doubt. No, this is not simply one of on a balance of probabilities, which is applied in the civil context. So it means then that as a prosecutor going to court, you must be fully equipped with the requisite evidence to be able to advance your case at that high standard. And oftentimes, this is not available because one, if you're reliant upon the testimonies given by victims of trafficking, oftentimes or not, they either change their testimonies or they withdraw from the proceedings once they've commenced. And so I think that is a really big challenge which confronts many Caribbean islands and which accounts for the low rates of prosecution. In addition, that there is, in some respects, a disconnect between the investigatory arm in the context of law enforcement and the prosecution would be the arm that brings the case before the judiciary. Oftentimes, because of a lack of early intervention, a lack of early conversations being held between those key stakeholders, we end up in a situation in which the evidence that is presented to the prosecutor is not sufficient to sustain a prosecution. And so in many islands, in fact, there have been numerous instances in which the case has been brought to court, an indictment has been filed, and as soon as the proceedings commence, and the prosecutor is now looking for evidence which would advance their case beyond a reasonable doubt, they realize that, well, we don't have enough evidence from our investigators. Oftentimes, it is too late because it may very well mean that the traffickers would have removed the remaining pieces of evidence, among other things. And so in that context, I think going forward, we need to address that disconnect between the prosecutorial arm and, of course, the investigatory arm of government. I think, more generally speaking, there is still a lack of general understanding and awareness as to trafficking in persons, what it entails, insofar as the indicia of trafficking in persons. I'm talking here about the acts, means, and purpose element, and how trafficking in persons in the context of adults is slightly different from the requirements which must be established in relation to child victims of trafficking. And invariably, that is an issue. Because if, as a prosecutor, you're going before the court on the assumption that for child victims of trafficking, you need to prove coercion and threat and abuse of a position of vulnerability, then it makes your case very much harder than it ought to be, because we know that international law and many pieces of our legislation don't necessarily require for there to be the presence of the means element in order to establish a case of child trafficking, right? So I think then, in sum, we have made progress as a Caribbean region over the last several years insofar as combating trafficking in persons, namely through our adoption of legislation, as well as, of course, the few instances in which we've seen prosecutions and, of course, successful convictions. But we still have a long way to go. We have a long way to go insofar as identifying victims of trafficking, in terms of ensuring that victims have appropriate level of trust in investigators as well as prosecutors, and more fundamentally, using what is now termed as proactive prosecutions. So of course, you've been familiar with proactive investigations, but now the new concept, the new paradigm shift is that of proactive prosecutions. And basically that entails not simply being reliant upon the testimonies that are provided rather by victims, but being more concerned with what we now describe as victimless prosecutions, where we rely upon geospatial evidence, we rely upon banking and other financial related evidence, we rely upon IT evidence, if available, in order to prosecute offenders. And the success of many other countries, namely the United Kingdom, and I had the privilege of working in the prosecution department in that context, to have seen, of course, how that actually works in practice. And it's really tremendous. And I would say it's a big advancement, which of course we as a Caribbean people need to emulate insofar as our prosecution standards are concerned. All right, so thanks very much. And I look forward to hearing your questions in due course.
Thank you very much, Jason. We look forward to hearing your explanations. Our next speaker is Mr. John Cassidy, who is Acting Immigration Liaison Manager for UK Immigration Enforcement International. And he likes to be known as Jerry, and most persons know him as Jerry. The office that he is involved in works to investigate and disrupt OIC affecting the UK, as well as managing regional capacity building projects with law enforcement colleagues in the Caribbean. This organization has a network of over 120 staff in 32 locations across the globe, supported by colleagues in the UK. Jerry has been in immigration for 20 years and began his career at Heathrow International Airport before moving to immigration intelligence in 2006. He has worked with immigration intelligence in 2006. He has worked with Immigration Enforcement International for the past 10 years and has been lucky enough to work in Iran, Pakistan, Oman, the UAE, as well as short tours to Nigeria and Switzerland. He has been in Jamaica since July 2017. Jerry hopes to learn from from IOM and regional colleagues today on their perspectives on member states regionally and globally, as well as sharing with us some of the steps the UK government has taken to combat human trafficking. So Jerry would be speaking to us now specifically on, are there places in the world where human trafficking is more prevalent? What are the drivers, and how does human trafficking impact gender in particular? What are some of the common strategies used in the UK to combat human trafficking? So without further ado, Jerry, you have the floor.
Thanks, Mr. Chairperson. Colleagues, thanks for the invitation to speak. So a lot to cover in a short time, but regarding prevalence, most recent figures suggest that there are 5.4 victims of modern slavery for every 1,000 people across the world. Investigation suggests that these figures are obviously different across the regions. The figures I have in front of me at the moment show that in Africa, that figure rises to 7.6 per 1,000 persons, down to Asia and the Pacific, which is 6.1, and it decreases until we get to the Americas, where the figure is 1.9. Now, these figures, of course, include modern slavery, forced labour and forced marriage. So between those regional differentiations, like Africa and Asia, of course, where forced marriage is a cultural norm, we can see that these figures are driven by other factors and prevalences. So the Global Slavery Index found that there are two major external factors which can drive modern slavery. And these are highly oppressive regimes which put populations to work to prop up the state, and conflict situations which result in the breakdown of the rule of law and order and protection systems. The UN breaks it down further in its report in 2018, and they suggest that the main drivers for modern slavery and human trafficking can be globalization, poverty, increased global inequality, lack of decent work, weak labour regulations, and gender inequality. This can then be further broken down between vulnerabilities between the state, the government itself, and victims, which again act as the drivers. So there are issues such as governance issues within state, which cover women's physical security, political rights, regulatory qualities, disabled rights. There's the lack of basic needs. Of course, there's sort of disease, undernourishment, access to clean water, inequality. So again, there's many cultural aspects to inequality and disenfranchised groups, which lead to violent crime, income coefficients, confidence in the judicial system. And when we discuss disenfranchised groups, we need to cover the aspect of acceptance of immigrants, immigration status, yeah, acceptance of minorities and same-sex rights. With this comes effects of conflict, and the impact of terrorism, internal conflicts, and internally displaced persons. So overarching all of this, we do have the globalization of the world, if you like. So the technology and the free market. So these unfettered market chains, which really in the real world support cuts in social spending, find that the wealth fails to trickle down to the lower people in the lower wage margins, and this also assists corruption. So the Global Slavery Index report in 2018 identified that prevalence was higher in the higher wage countries, and should therefore underscores those countries' responsibilities. So we move to gender, and as gender has historically resulted in a hierarchical distribution of power and rights that favours men and disadvantages women. So from this, research around the world demonstrates the strong linkages between women in the poverty sectors, characterised by absence in labour rights and decent work. So we find that women normally work in the care economies, accommodation and food services, and in these industries they can be subject to forced labour because they're at the bottom of the global value chain. At the same time, men and boys have been vulnerable to forms of slavery in economic sectors such as construction, manufacturing and fishing. And this is particularly relevant to the Caribbean, as the Caribbean is highly dependent on agriculture, tourism, and also faces vulnerability to natural disasters. So one aspect of the gender which is also quite striking is that of the sort of recognised 41 million people that are subject to forms of modern slavery, 71% of the victims are female. And this, for the forced labour, 99% of the victims in the commercial sex industry are females, and females account for 58% in other sectors. So again, we can see here that these gender differences in modern slavery and human trafficking are driven by gender inequality, poverty and cultural norms. So the UK measures, in the UK, the strategic measures have included new legislation. So we have the Modern Slavery Act, and we have an active human rights and equality legislations. We also empower law enforcement. So we have the Modern Slavery Strategy from 2014. And along with the legislation, we increased the powers and have imposed tougher sentences and minimised opportunities for perpetrators to carry out modern slavery and human trafficking crimes. Modern slavery law in the UK now incorporates transparency and supply chain provisions, TSIC, and the tougher sentences include maximum life sentences for perpetrators of human trafficking. The Home Office in 2019 established a Policy and Evidence Centre on modern slavery and human trafficking. Along with investment and awareness, we also have multilateral initiatives. The UK had the call to action in 2017. Our Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office colleagues now have an international modern slavery and migration envoy. And in the UK, we have placed independent child trafficking guardians with local authorities across England and Wales. So along with this, the UK government commissioned an independent review of the Modern Slavery Act, which covered 4 areas, and the themes that they covered were the independent anti-slavery commissioner, transparency in supply chains, independent child trafficking guardians, and the legal application of the Modern Slavery Act, which we've covered just previously. So the results of the UK measures, strategic measures, just some quick figures here, which show that from December 2016 to November 2019, There was an increase of 780% in metropolitan and modern slavery police operations in the UK. From 2018 to 2019, there was an increase of 36% to almost 7,000 referrals to the National Referral Mechanism. And the year to March 2019, there was a rise in 49% in modern slavery offences recorded in the UK. And that same time, there was an increase of 18% in convictions for modern slavery and human trafficking crimes. And that total was 219, which was a 68% conviction rate. So that's very briefly, that covers those three main areas, Mr. Chair, colleagues. Thanks for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you very much, Jerry. So participants, we've heard from all our panelists so far, and we're about to engage in the open discussions. But before we do that, our host, CARICOM Impacts, will present us a very short video, and then we would lead off into the discussion phase.
Slavery, a terrible time in our history. The kidnapping, buying and selling of people for profit, the exploitation of another human being. It still exists today. It has a new name: human trafficking. Anyone can be a victim. There is forced labor, sexual exploitation, and domestic servitude. Human trafficking is a worldwide problem and an emerging concern for us here in Trinidad and Tobago. If you know of or suspect human trafficking activity, call the Counter-Trafficking Hotline at 800-4CTU or 800-4288. Human trafficking is a crime. Identify it, report it, stop it. A message from the Counter-Trafficking Unit of the Ministry of National Security.
Good, and this takes us really, reminds us of why we gathered here today, in observance of the International Day for the Abolition of Slavery. A lot of our participants have been fielding questions related to slavery and human trafficking. And to kick off the discussion, I would really like to direct this first question to Jason for a legal perspective. What is human trafficking? What is slavery? Can the terms slavery and human trafficking be used interchangeably? And if not, what is the difference? Is there a global consensus of the definition of slavery and human trafficking? And I'm sure with those points, we will have a very, very engaging discussion. So Jason, please, if you could, I'd really like you to respond to this, and any the other panelists who would like to contribute afterwards.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. I think that's an excellent question. And I think it's a question which is particularly relevant in a Caribbean context where there are geopolitical concerns and legal concerns which touch and concern the issue of slavery and how it is, of course, distinguished from trafficking in persons. Now, trafficking in persons has an international definition, which is found in the Palermo Protocol of 2001. It basically involves a tripartite approach to determining the trafficking, at least in the case of adults. So there must be the acts element, which would be things related to recruitment and transportation, harboring, and so forth. With, of course, there being the means element in the form of threats and coercion and abuse of a position of vulnerability. They must be for the purpose of exploitation. And exploitation varies considerably to include exploitation of the prostitution of others, commercial exploitation, the removal of organs, domestic servitude, forced labor, even trafficking for illicit purposes. And I heard colleague from Guyana mention in reference to the use of trafficked victims for the purposes of an illegal activity, or legal activities, in that case, drug trafficking as well as arms trafficking. And of course, that's an evolving dynamic. It's something which the UK has been dealing with over the last 10 years or so, and which is now being confronted in the Caribbean. But interestingly, The Paloma Protocol also, insofar as the purpose element is concerned, goes on to say, for the purpose of exploitation would also include slavery and slave-like practices. And I think that brings into the fore the question which you asked. Are there circumstances in which human trafficking can be slavery? And is modern slavery, the description which we've used in the last several years to describe human trafficking, an accurate one? I speak in particular in relation to the video that we just saw, which gave the impression that there's a direct correlation, even a lack of mutual exclusivity between those two concepts. And I just wanted to refute some of those considerations on legal bases, political bases, even geopolitical bases, all right? And I hope that you allow me to do so. So I would accept, in accordance with the Paloma Protocol, that there might be instances in which one of the manifestations of trafficking in persons is that of slavery or slave-like practices, all right? But my research, and certainly the jurisprudence emanating from international courts and tribunals, seem to suggest that those exist in very limited circumstances. So for example, if somebody is recruited by virtue of threat or use of force and held in a circumstance in which their services are being bought and sold, that would amount to a situation of trafficking for the purposes of slavery. That is quite a different conversation from saying that trafficking in persons is modern slavery. One of the manifestations of trafficking in persons can be slavery. But again, that arises in very limited circumstances. Now, when we talk about slavery, we talk about a concept which is ubiquitous. It is a concept which is meant to demarcate a situation in which the person is held, and of course, I heard that Lourdes gave a definition slightly earlier, in conditions which relate to that person's ownership by somebody else. So international definition under the 1926 Slavery Convention, as well as the 1956 Slavery Convention, seem to suggest that it is a situation in which, or status or condition of a person in which another person is exercising some of the indicia of ownership over the other individual. Now, not in every circumstance will you have somebody exercising those indicia of ownership. When we think about ownership, we think about being able to buy and sell. We're thinking about you becoming my property as such. We think about excessive restriction on movement. But I think the key principle here to bear in mind is that it is meant to capture exceptional circumstances. Now, slavery is a peremptory norm of international law. That means, whereas forced labor, for example, states can have exceptions to forced labor. So there are certain circumstances in which the state can allow or ask people to engage in activities which might amount to forced labor. In relation to into slavery, there are no exceptions. It is a norm that is prohibited at all times and in all circumstances by international law. It therefore means that international law prejudices in a positive way slavery, and it only would recognize slavery as existing in the most extreme circumstances. So therefore, the reference to human trafficking as slavery is conceptually inconsistent with international law. It is legally also inconsistent with international law. If you're saying that in limited circumstances, one of the manifestations of trafficking in persons is that of slavery, I could appreciate that. But to make an all-encompassing, ubiquitous claim that trafficking in persons is modern slavery is conceptually wrong. Now, if you were to look, for example, at the International Criminal Court statute under Article 7, it speaks of crimes against humanity. Now, enslavement is one of those crimes. And to show the threshold which must be satisfied, I'll point to some of the indicia which the statute in question refers to. It refers to there being which somebody is exercising the power associated with ownership over somebody else, but in circumstances where there is a systematic attack on the person affected or persons affected, and it is widespread. Again, the thresholds are very different from a simple, not a simple incident. I don't want to trivialize trafficking in persons because it is an issue which adversely affects victims, and in many instances, victims suffer tremendously, all right? But what I'm saying is that conceptually and legally, there is a difference in terms of the threshold, the gravity of the crime in question when one compares trafficking in persons and slavery, all right? Now, I'm going to mention something which I am saying here in my capacity as an academic. It is not being said in the capacity of a representative of the University of the West Indies or any other institution. The notion of modern slavery in and of itself is, again, conceptually difficult for me to reconcile with our Caribbean realities. And certainly, speaking more generally speaking, to peoples who might have in the past suffered from the crime of enslavement. I say that because when I look at the research, the reason why international courts and tribunals referred to trafficking in persons, in some instances as being slavery, is because the instruments in question that they were dealing with did not specifically include trafficking in persons. So the courts and tribunals had to adopt what we call in law, international law, a teleological approach to treaty interpretation. In other words, a purposive approach, a very broad approach. So even if the treaty doesn't make explicit reference to trafficking in persons, they would have interpreted slavery to include trafficking in persons. That is why that terminology has come into existence. But in the last 10 years or so, without regard to the origins of that terminology, it has been appropriated and used in various contexts outside of context, all right? So it is used now to describe every instance of trafficking in persons without regard
Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
But in terms of timing though, you think you just have 1 more minute to quickly wrap up before we go on to answer some of the other questions. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. As you can see, it's a matter that I'm passionate about and that I've written about on numerous occasions. But the point is, it has been appropriated as a terminology, wrongfully so, for political and other reasons, and it is not conceptually and not legally consistent with what international law provides. All right, I think that's the essence of what I'm saying. And of course, I know that there will be disagreement in the course of our discussions, and I'm happy to refute and respond to any claims that would be advanced subsequent to this.
And thank you very much. The floor is open for anyone who would like to be able to respond to what Jason has said or offer further comments on the issue. Yeah, I'm checking to see if there are any hands raised.
Well, I'm not sure how we can raise our hands here, but I would have really loved to hear from a law enforcement perspective, because Jason has given you the theory and conceptually how it's conceptualized by law, but in practice, if we can see some of the actual cases that persons, law enforcement officers would have been exposed to. But one thing I would want to say concerning the whole debate on slavery and human trafficking and whether it's one and the same, in the Trinidad and Tobago context, in our definition, we have defined what slavery is in our TIPS law, and it is in keeping with the UN Palermo Protocol. Right? We have also have slavery as a subset of a human trafficking offense. What I have found though is when you look globally, you'd realize that the term slavery and modern day slavery is more used as a way to sensitize or to stimulate a certain response from persons or a certain public response from persons when it comes to human trafficking. Because what we try to do is not trivialize the issue of human trafficking or not trivialize the offense of human trafficking. It is as serious, or it is considered as serious as slavery, right? So you have that concept in terms of a public awareness, public relations approach. And then you have the other side where you have, if you mention the word slavery, in some countries, for example, in the African continent, if the word slavery is mentioned in the context of human trafficking, it is considered an offense. They are offended by it because we cannot begin to comprehend in our part of the world, in the Caribbean, what slavery really was for those persons in the African continent. So there you have, it's going to be a very interesting discussion, I think, this morning. to really see where we are. Are they one and the same? And I don't know if we can really come to some consensus or some agreement this morning, but it would really be interesting to see what the input is from. I would love to hear from Rodney Ellis from Antigua as a law enforcement officer on the panel in terms of what he is seeing and how this is playing out.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wheeler. And Rodney, you are free to respond to
Sharon, before we go to Rodney, can we hear what Rose wanted to say, because her hand was up for a while?
Certainly. Yes, thank you, Rose.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Wheeler. I just want to say I think this is a really interesting discussion, and it's important that when we talk about whether we define something with one terminology or another, that we think about for what purpose. As Ms. Wheeler just said, is it about sensitizing someone? Is it about a legal determination of status by law enforcement? Is it about offering the person protection and shelter and admission into a program or giving them a visa? So I think from an Iowan perspective, we work very closely with the Palermo Protocol. I want to remind everyone also that trafficking has been recognized as a crime against humanity. And I think the efforts to talk about modern day slavery, which is not defined in international law, is an umbrella term to sort of bring together some of these forms of extreme exploitation, such as forced labor, human trafficking, etc. But I think it's very important to know that the emphasis is on recognizing the suffering and the coercion that people go through, the fact that people are kept in these situations and forced because they are being manipulated, there are debts, there's violence. And I think that is why often you see this terminology of modern day slavery, not slavery, but modern day slavery used to capture some of these ideas and to sensitize. But from a practical point of view on the ground, when we are working with someone to determine whether they are a victim, we use the act, means, and purpose from the Palermo Protocol. That is how you determine if someone was or was not trafficked in a practical manner on the ground. Thank you so much.
Yes, good morning again. I'm in agreement with Jason with regard to personally using the term modern day slavery sometimes out of context. However, the practical situation of this that we have, and during investigation and my part, we have seen all the elements, almost all the elements of slavery, the control of these persons, the exploitation, and example and from information and during an investigation. And I'm moving away from sexual exploitation to domestic servitude, where all the elements of human trafficking was in it, with regard to recruitment, transportation, and everything of the like. And that person in a home cannot leave, being beaten to work on a daily basis, nothing to eat, and eventually have to escape. When she been locked up in the house, the person, the trafficker leave her alone home. That's when she gets to escape. And all these go back to slavery. What I understand about slavery, that they normally used to work in the field and been beaten. And we have seen that in our area here. And I am of the view, well, we have the view that that is slavery. I went straight to the domestic servitude. I didn't touch the sexual exploitation. But domestic servitude that we see, we receive that information. As a matter of fact, medical evidence shows that that person was malnourished. Because so it coincides with the fact that what she told the police was actually true, based on the medical evidence that was adduced during the investigation. So definitely, I am of the view that it's a form of modern day slavery when it comes to this type of situation.
Thank you, ASP, for that perspective. Is there anybody on the floor that would like to contribute? You can think about your answer. While you're doing that, Mr. Thomas has asked a question or made a comment, and one of the participants, he has said that while the needs are relatively similar, regardless of whether someone is an international or domestic victim, adult or minor, one point is clear, and the magnitude of these needs varies for each victim depending on his or her circumstances. including mental needs. I would like the panelists to consider that as well, as we're having this a very engaging discussion in terms of the difference between slavery and trafficking in persons.
I would want, while we're deliberating, because I think there are a lot of questions in the chat, lots of questions in the chat. So I'm hoping we're able to get through the questions. But with respect to the needs of victims of trafficking, a victim of trafficking has a very complex psychosocial issues and needs. And most victims come from a history, or they have a history of abuse, whether it is emotional abuse, physical abuse, or some type of sexual abuse. So yes, I do agree with the person saying that their needs, meeting their needs is critical as part of the recovery and the recuperation process. I do remember Dr. Haynes mentioning earlier that it's difficult to get the cooperation of witnesses and victims. And one thing I could say is in Trinidad and Tobago, we have been pretty successful in getting victims to cooperate in cases. Yes, you always have to deal with the fear factor and the factor of, they're fearful of reprisals and the Stockholm syndrome and the attachment that they feel to their traffickers who are like godfathers to them. But as I said at the beginning, in my introduction, it's a matter of giving them viable alternatives. If victims don't have viable alternatives, beyond trusting the system and trusting law enforcement, they need to have viable alternatives. So whatever need that trafficker was meeting in their lives, it's important that the response from the state and the response from the supporting agencies or agencies working with the state is able to assist that victim in meeting their needs. And their basic needs, yes, there's food, shelter, clothing, but there are needs beyond that, and it depends on the need that trafficker was filling in particular. Sometimes that need can be a need to be a part of a family, a need to be loved, a need for education, a need for some type of self-worth and value. And this is where the response, the national response from the state, is very critical in preventing that victim, first of all, pulling them out mentally from the situation, because we could physically remove a victim from a situation and psychologically, emotionally, sexually, they are still attached to that situation or those persons. So whatever recovery, recuperation, rehabilitation activities or processes we engage in, it must really deliver, rescue, set that victim free in every aspect and every area of their lives and meet the needs of that particular victim.
Thank you very much for that response, Alana. And along that same thread, Ms. Burton has asked, so how do you deal with the situation after being informed by the victims? Where do they stand in terms of their security? And I think this also speaks towards the needs of the victims. So if anyone, panelists, would care to respond to this, or Ms. Wheeler, seeing as you already have the floor.
Yes, I can answer if you want.
Please do.
Okay, about the security of the victims and the coordination, also on the communication, we need to think about the trafficker. Who is the trafficker? And the majority of the times the trafficker have more money and a lot of defendants and lawyers to help them. So it's very more difficult for us to take care of the security of the victims. You need to understand what is the modality of the trafficking in person crime in each cases, to understand who are the traffickers and the money and the power and the corruption issues. So you need to take care very well of each of the victims. Sometimes the victims go again with the traffickers. So you need to take care very well the security of the victims of the shelter, or the continues, if they continues with their own life. So take care of the family of the traffickers, don't go to push her to change the declaration. So also about the coordination with the victim. So the information is the victim is not just only at the beginning. You need to be in coordination and communication with the victims all days, almost all days or all weeks, because the needs of the victims are changing and the security of the victims also changing. Maybe she can receive some text message for the trafficker or maybe the lawyer of the trafficker. So you need to take care very well each of the victims and each of the cases of human trafficking. And talking about the slavery too, when we talk about slavery, it's a term like 100 years ago when the slavery talk about the laws of the slavery. But we need to think at this time it's human trafficking. And just part of the human trafficking is the slavery. So we need to be open to understand the different kinds and modalities of human trafficking that we have, because the trafficker changes. As you know, at this time, we have only not just ownership. The trafficker says to the victim, you have a debt, you come here to help, or maybe you can go to work to a hotel or a restaurant. So the victim don't understand that she's complained to do that at the beginning. So maybe the victims only thinks that she has a debt with the trafficker, but not the ownership. So it's the difference between the terms about human trafficking. It's not just slavery at this time, because it was 100 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that response. And you introduced quite a significant thread there. In your view, there's a view that some forms of slavery are acceptable, especially biblical slavery. What are your views on this, please?
Sorry, I had to laugh. I don't know if anyone else wants to respond, but I had to laugh when I heard that question.
Please,
I don't know of any type of slavery that is acceptable. Honestly, I don't know no type of slavery is acceptable. And if we go back to the Bible days, if we're talking about Joseph was sold by his own brothers to slaves, to slave traders, because the brothers were jealous of him, basically. In the case of Joseph, I mean, it worked out and it worked in favor for his family, because he ended up in Egypt and he ended up becoming a trusted employee. Well, he was a slave, really, of the Pharaoh at that time. It was not a favorable condition back in the Bible days. And even when the children of Israel were enslaved in Egypt, it was not under favorable circumstances. So to my knowledge or understanding, there is no aspect of slavery that is considered favorable at all.
If I may, I think
yes, please.
Make reference to there being almost a condoning of slavery in a biblical context. I think particular scripture in Ephesians, which says, slaves obey your master, not understanding the context in which that was said. In law, traditionally, but less so now, there is a recognition of an employment relationship between those people who are considered to be masters and those people who are considered to be slaves, or people who over whom control is exercised. All right. So that type of relationship existed back then, and it, in fact, up to the 1960s, it was recognized as such in our law, where the relationship between the parties in question is defined by reference to the level of control that the other party has over them. So if I can tell you as an employer to work at X amount, X time for X number of days, and I can tell you what equipment to use, etc., that would have been indicative of a master-servant relationship as such. So I don't necessarily think, based on my reading of the Bible, that there's been any express approval of slavery as such. But I can see how the scripture can be interpreted as such, all right? Because obviously everybody's subject to their own interpretation. People apply different methods and tools of interpretation. But I don't think that on the face of it, the Bible condones it. And I don't think that in the context of the modern dispensation of Christianity, New Testament Christians, that there could ever be a condoning of slavery or slave-like practices.
Thank you so much for that, Jason. There's some more questions from the floor. Before I get into it, though, I would like to introduce a gendered perspective into what we are discussing right now. Is forced marriage considered to be a modern form of slavery?
Ms. Young?
Yes.
Okay.
Rose, you can.
Go ahead. Please go ahead, Miss. Lourdes, go ahead.
Okay. Yes. It's one of the new modalities of the human trafficking cases. Is the forced marriage? Yes. And other countries have in their own criminal law, in the trafficking in person law, specific this kind of modality, because some person give her daughters or her boys for another person and receive money or something like that. In different countries, we have also in Mexico, we have this kind of modality of forced marriage, and sometimes using with the tourist sector to get married to foreign, like an American person. You are going to have the nationality or maybe more possibilities to go and give money to the family. So yes, we have in other countries in their own law in human trafficking cases.
Thank you so much, Lourdes. Anybody else cares to contribute?
Yes, thank you. Oh, pardon me.
Can I go?
Yes, please, ASP.
Yeah, this is for Jason. With regard to marriage, a form of human trafficking. What I want to put in the discussion is that you would have a situation where you have a perpetrator who have been charged for human trafficking. However, they ended up marrying through the victim, even somebody for the victim, with a view not to testify against the perpetrator. And because in some laws that their wife or husband is a compatible witness, but not a comparable witness. I want to hear the legal discussion on that from Jason. While I'm on to, I just wanted to add something to Ms. Wheeler's presentation with regard to security. Yes, what we're noticing during investigation part of it is that we might be able to secure those victims during the early stage. However, if there's a situation, there is repatriation, that those persons wanted to go back to their country of origin, then there we face some difficulty in continuing to secure those victims and also to secure their family, because we know during human trafficking that these traffickers do some background check on their victims with regard to knowing the family, know where they live, and so on. So sometimes it is difficult, and there where we face some issues in investigating matters, because once these victims realize that the perpetrators know a lot about them and their family, they tend to be reluctant in cooperating with the investigation. So sometimes security is an issue, and once it goes to, once those persons are returned to their country of origin, then there are some issues there in continuing to secure them. Yes, you might have your networking with the security forces in those countries, but in those large countries, sometimes these persons are very difficult to control or keep under control in a secure environment. So I just wanted to add that to the discussion.
Oh, ASP, thank you so much. Before we go on to the other person that has raised their hand, you raised an interesting perspective when it came to the person's own country. And from our participants, Mrs. Ana Picado Campos, first she thanks every one of your panelists for your informative dissertations. And she has two questions specifically for Ms. Borland. One, can someone be trafficked in their own country? And what if a victim of trafficking has committed a crime? So Ms. Borland, that question was specifically to you, but after you address it, the other panelists may be free to chip in. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. We heard about the definition of trafficking and that the actions that these criminal networks take include moving people around, moving them from one community or one country to another. So we know migration often is part of human trafficking, but the answer to the question is that you do not have to go to another country to be trafficked. You can be a victim in your own community, in your own country. And this can be very challenging for us to recognize. Sometimes it's easier to see a foreign person in a situation of exploitation than to recognize what are accepted or tolerated forms of exploitation that we have in our own community. So the answer is yes, you can be a victim in your own country. Regarding the question on crimes, this is a really important question. Oftentimes, and we've heard this from other experts on the panel, victims of trafficking are forced to break the law. So they may be forced to transport drugs, they may be forced to assault people, they may be forced to carry out sex work in a context where it's illegal. All kinds of illegal activities can be part of human trafficking, and this is really challenging to sort out who is who and to understand who is being forced to conduct these activities and who is running these networks and these activities. There is a core principle in human trafficking response to never criminalize a victim. So as soon as we understand that someone looks to be a victim, we need to prioritize their protection and their assistance. And if they are an illegal migrant, if they have been in some other criminal context, those become secondary considerations because they have a protective status as a survivor of trafficking. So I think that's really important to reemphasize here. I just wanted to also, before I give back the microphone, mention in terms of gender, we heard from other people that oftentimes this is a gendered crime. We heard from our expert from the UK that the majority of victims being identified are women and girls, especially in sexual exploitation. And we know that women are also in domestic servitude, as we just heard. So gender-based violence is linked to human trafficking, and in fact, trafficking is a recognized form of gender-based violence. And we often see certain kinds of labor exploitation affecting more men and boys or women and girls, or even people of diverse gender identity. So I just wanted to mention that. And then finally, linked to gender, remember that seduction or romance is a form of recruitment for some trafficking networks. So sometimes that lie, that false promise of a job is actually a relationship, and you think you have someone in your life who is now your new person, your new husband even, and it turns out it's a lie to force you into some sort of exploitation. So we do see that as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your response, and your extension to the gendered perspective is extremely important. I recognize Mr. Haynes. You have your hand up.
Yes, I just want to follow up in relation to the non-punishment of trafficked victims, because it is an issue that has arisen considerably over the last couple of years in other jurisdictions, including the UK, and certainly more recently in the Caribbean as well. So in terms of the legal position, the general principle is that nobody should be exonerated on the face of it for crimes that they've committed. So that's a general principle. All persons, there's a public interest in ensuring that all persons who have committed crimes suffer appropriate consequences. The exception to that principle is in circumstances where victims of trafficking, for example, have committed other offenses while being trafficked, all right, such as prostitution, immigration-related offenses. The law requires, at least the legislative prescription, that they on the victim's part, them having committed the offense as a direct result of being trafficked. So the mere fact of being part of a trafficking experience is not sufficient evidence that could be tendered successfully by a victim of trafficking. Barbados' legislation and Trinidad's legislation impose even a higher threshold. Not only do they require victims to bring evidence of there being a nexus between trafficking and the offense that they committed, but that they would not have had any culpability at all, meaning they must show that their sense of control would have been completely extinguished, all right? As you might imagine, that is really hard for a victim of trafficking to actually prove. So therefore, when I've worked with prosecutions department across the Eastern Caribbean and elsewhere, so in the UK, the approach usually that we suggest is one, law enforcement officers, first line responders, are to ensure that in the event that they see evidence of the victim being exploited and as a result they've committed offense, don't even investigate the matter as if the victim had committed the offense in the first place. So that is from the investigator's perspective. At the level of the prosecution, we as prosecutors would apply a twofold test. One, we ask ourselves, is there sufficient evidence to ground this prosecution? And two, is it in the public interest to ground this prosecution? On the first of the test, we usually have the evidence that the victim has committed a crime. All right, so that is not an issue. But we say that it is not within the public's interest to prosecute this person, even though we have evidence that the person has committed a crime. Now, what if we don't exercise our discretion and the person ends up being convicted for that crime? What recourse is available? That person then could apply to the court for what we consider a stay of process because of abuse of the process. All right. So the judge will then intervene and exercise his or her supervisory jurisdiction and say that an ordinary competent prosecutor, one who is aware of all of the circumstances, would have arrived at the conclusion that this person should not have been prosecuted for the offense in the first place. All right. So there are various means by which the victim can be exonerated. And even if the judge then doesn't take that approach, the victim can still rely upon the defense of duress or necessity, which applies as a matter of common law. All right. So generally speaking, the advice then is that don't even let it get to the court system. Deal with it at the point of investigation and prosecution in terms of exercising your discretion not to investigate the particular matter or prosecute the matter against the victim of trafficking.
Thank you very much, Jason. And I recognize Ms. Wheeler wants to respond.
Yes, thanks again. I actually wanted to respond to ASP Ellis and what he's indicated, which is so true. And it's always good to have the practitioners in panels such as this with respect to victims and getting the cooperation of victims and the challenges faced with getting their cooperation. Well, in the first place, we know there is the whole debate of not relying only on a victim or witness as your main evidence. But unfortunately, in our jurisdiction so far, the victims and the witnesses, they are the ones bringing the main evidence in the cases, in the human trafficking cases. And until we are able to overcome that, we will continue to face the challenges of having victims and witnesses cooperating. But again, I go back to repeating, the state response and the national response to human trafficking is very critical in getting the cooperation of witnesses and victims. So the Palermo Protocol caters. I know that different islands in the Caribbean have adopted parts in whole of the UN protocol, the Palermo Protocol. But in Trinidad and Tobago, we have adopted the majority of the Palermo Protocol. So as such, with respect to the assistance provided to victims who are non-nationals, we have a provision in our legislation where victims who are non-nationals, they are afforded what we call a minister's permit, which regularizes their immigration status here and which allows them to live, work, and remain in Trinidad and Tobago for the duration of the court matter. What that does basically is that it secures your witness in your jurisdiction. So you have some level of authority over the movements, the security of that person. You also have the witness protection programs that witnesses could go into depending on the threshold or their level of risk and threat. And you also have, if you have victims or witnesses who have dependents, their dependents can also be brought under the care of the state that is prosecuting for the duration of the court matter. And the advantage you have of that is that when you have repatriated a victim or witness, sometimes it's very difficult to find them when you're ready to start the court matter. And like in Trinidad, because our matters take so long to start, and at magistrate times it's 5, 7, 10 years, we're waiting for a matter to start. And 10 years, 5 years later, that victim may have moved to some other country, some part of Europe or somewhere, and you can't find them, right? So it is actually it's actually to the advantage of the state to have them in a space where you could find them, basically. So while it may seem to incur a cost on the state, this is where you can allow them to work. So if they're allowed to work, they are able to sustain themselves and help themselves, and they are not a burden on the state. They can eventually rent their own spaces. And I mean, we have had foreign nationals as victims here in Trinidad. They have moved on. They are not a financial burden on the state, and they have reintegrated into society. Some of them have gotten married, they have had children, they have their own businesses and things like that. So if your country allows that, it really helps in the prosecution, because you wouldn't want a case where a police officer invests hours and hours and hours of work into an investigation. The state invests hours of resources into an investigation, and then when time comes to the trial, there's no witness, right? So it's really it's a balance of really knowing value for money and getting your value for money and for the resources that you have invested.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wheeler. And following on from your response from the floor, we have a question from Ms. Alitha Louis Descartes. And of course, her question was, how do you deal with the victims and perpetrators of human trafficking? I know we've been focusing a lot on the victims, but with regard to the perpetrators, Ms. Descartes would like to know some more about how specifically those are dealt with.
I can chime in on that.
Please do.
As one of my colleagues mentioned earlier on, these persons always have their attorney ready and able to defend them because they have the resources to do that. However, once we have the evidence or enough evidence, then we would move to charge. And as we mentioned, the lawyers are there, so most likely they would get bail because these type of offenses, you can obtain bail. The difficulty there is that once they're on bail, or even if they are incarceration, they still have their links and they have their networking that still operates like if nothing happened. So sometimes we have to break through the whole networking to try and get, to dismantle them, I should say, dismantle the networking. Because once that networking is up and running, it makes it much more difficult for the victim and the witnesses to cooperate and to at least sometimes they might disappear or they might even pay. These perpetrators would pay to get these persons out of the jurisdiction. And sometimes it's difficult to control that. So the perpetrators, but the good thing in our act is that you can always have a freeze on the resources once you move to investigate money laundering. So if we move to the money laundering investigation alongside the human trafficking, then you might have some leeway there to put a freeze on their resources, and hence they might not be able to provide those type of services to their network and even to get these persons out of the jurisdiction, and sometimes we can locate them to give evidence. I want to add something to what Ms. Wheeler was saying also too. In our jurisdiction in Antigua and Barbuda, there is some immunity to prosecution for some offenses that might be committed by the victim during the course of the investigation. With regard to illegal entry into the country, if some person enter the country illegally, you're immune from prosecution there. If you overstay your time, you are immune from prosecution there also. What is of great importance that Ms. Wheeler mentioned that I'm in total agreement with is when these persons have been identified as victims and they want to remain in the country, that you make provision, and our act make provision for that so that they can work. So as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, that you have to get work permit to work. However, once you've been identified as a victim, then the provision has been made for you to obtain a job, to maintain yourself, pay your own rent. So it's not a cost on the state. So that is enshrined in our legislation too. So with regard to the perpetrators, once they have the resources at hand, they will always try to do something to prevent prosecution. Also too, I should add also too, they even reach to the stage that they might want to pay off the relatives of the victim to convince them not to cooperate with the police. So these are the type of things that we are seeing. So Once that person has been arrested, what the court would make a ruling that no contact whatsoever, whether by the perpetrator or by his or her agent, to communicate with victim with the victim family. So I just want to add that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ellis. Mr. Sinclair has asked to take the floor. You may speak.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity. Are you hearing me clearly?
Yes, we're hearing you clearly.
Okay. Two things. I just like to add what Ms. Wheeler said about the social care, and just I hope that everyone keeps in mind that drug treatment is very important as part of the recovery process for all victims, especially those who are prostitution, because there are a number of them that use a lot of substances during that time. So once they're rescued, yes, I hope that everybody keeps in mind that that too is a very important component. But one thing I would like to throw in, because jumping on from the last question that was asked, and of course the contribution from Mr. Ellis, we interviewed through our radio program, Our Independency, and of course it's collaboration with the Counter Trafficking Unit. But a couple of years ago, we interviewed a young lady who was caused to carry drugs from Trinidad to the UK. And when she got to the airport, the drugs was handed to her by a uniformed personnel of the airport security, a female uniformed personnel. And she was in uniform. And she took her to the bathroom and handed her the drugs on a belt. So she put the belt on her waist and she moved to the, she went to board her flight to the UK. The only reason she got caught is the guy who came to pick her up outside of the airport, he almost hit someone on a crosswalk, and that caused a commotion, and she was, then they took them back into the airport, and that's how she was caught. Otherwise, she would have gotten off scot-free. Now, the question is, we have a lot of law enforcement officers and officials involved in this. How are we prepared to tackle that too as well, and not only tackle it, but name them and shame them? Because as we know, there are different levels of drug trafficking and human trafficking, and she obviously fell in a high level because there was law enforcement involved. How does the region plan to deal with those officials, customs, immigration, and the likes involved in this as well? Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Garth. And I very pertinent questions, and you raise an important issue there. Before the panelists answer your questions, with regard to drug trafficking or persons being on drugs, is it that, or has anybody seen in their experience, in their professional experience, or have victims report that they were placed on drugs as a means of control to ensure that they were dependent and remain dependent upon their traffickers? Is that ever expressed? Has that ever been seen?
Sure, I can answer that straight up, yes. Some of the time, I wouldn't say most, some of the time, they are forced to use drugs and to remain in that type of exploitation.
Okay, very good. So it's very, Mr. Sinclair's point is very relevant. I see Ms. Wheeler's hand up, please.
Yes, I was just responding to your question. Yes, drugs and also alcohol. You would find that yes, there's cocaine, there is marijuana, but you also have the party drugs, you know, that we know is new now with the ecstasy and all these different meth and all these different types of drugs. And you also have the alcohol, the use of alcohol to help the victims cope with their situation. They take it themselves to help them cope with the situation. And also sometimes they're forced to take it for them to perform acts and stuff. And you find that very often happening with minors in particular, you know, when minors are drugged into behaving or conducting themselves in a particular way. So yes, I do agree with Mr. Sinclair that that part is also critical in dealing with sometimes the psychologists, the psychosocial support, you may not capture it because it may not be an addiction where they need to have it every day or 3 times a day or 4 times a day. But what you realize is maybe after a few days or a few weeks, without having that substance in their body, it can cause a lot of traumatic reactions. And anybody who's a psychologist in the forum will understand what I'm referring to, really. And then it can impact adversely on the place where the person is being accommodated. It can impact adversely on during the course of an investigation and the recording of statements. The person starts to behave or conduct themselves in a particular way, and you may be treating it as a medical condition or as something else when it's really a substance situation that is taking place. So it's very important, yes, that we are aware of that and that we have responses for that.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wheeler. Ms. Boland, your hand is up. And then I would ask both the UK and Guyana to, on the last points that we've been discussing, if that is the same or they've recognized those same patterns in their jurisdictions. So Ms. Boland?
Thank you. Yes, I want to add on to what was just said that we've also seen use of substances or forced use of substances in labor exploitation. So not just in bar settings or spaces where the people are or the women are being forced to sell alcohol and drugs and use it or using it for coping, but also, for example, men in labor exploitation who are given stimulants so that they can work longer hours in construction or work longer hours in fishing. These are things that we've seen in our studies. I also wanted to mention that in terms of the health needs and the mental health needs that have come up in some of the questions and comments, in addition to those related to substance abuse and misuse, we heard about malnutrition, and we know that it's really common for people in situations of trafficking to be very mistreated. They don't have potable water. They don't have, they can't take care of themselves. If they're hurt or sick, they have to keep working no matter what. So it's very common for people to be malnourished. That's a very common identifier of victims of trafficking across all kinds of exploitation. And one of the most important services when they first are rescued or identified is health, both physical and mental health services. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that interaction. Guyana or the UK, do you find that similar patterns in your jurisdictions?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, it's Jerry here. Yeah, absolutely. I would just endorse what my colleague Rosalind said. There is the tendency to exploit persons, vulnerable persons, and the introduction of substances for addiction to exploit, in the workplaces, wherever they may be. What we find also in the UK is after arriving in the UK and within domestic trafficking, that persons with addictions can also be forced to apply for genuine documents, which are then recycled by the traffickers, internationally, like passports and identity cards, etc. And so that sort of fulfills the circle for the traffickers from a domestic and international angle.
Thank you so much for that. Coming from the floor, this question is directed to Jason from Kimoy Thomas, and just changing the direction slightly. He would like you to give some examples as to when forced labor is allowed. Remember, we had that discussion earlier on. And what are some of the exceptions to forced labor so that you can clarify the concept. So Jason, please, if you could be able to respond to Kimoy Thomas's question.
Yes, absolutely. So the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the ILO Forced Labor Convention, the Slavery Convention, in relation to forced labor, outline exceptions. And these exceptions would include things like labor, or labor that is part of community activities, or there are certain circumstances in which emergent labor on the part of the individual in question. Also, an exception is created for military service, all right? So there are circumstances involving the military enrollment where you can be compelled to do so, and that is allowed for by international law. So those four circumstances, emergencies in particular, as well as military and prison service, would be instances in which there will be exceptions to the general prohibition against forced labor.
Thank you very much for that response, Jason. Is there anybody else that would like to contribute specifically? Okay. So looking at some more questions from the floor, and of course, yes, Joycelyn.
Can we show a short video and then go back to the questioning? Thank you.
Most certainly impacts.
With my unemployed status, my home was a mess. To be honest, my life was full of stress. With bills piled up and nothing to eat, my landlord came and applied the heat. Every day job hunting, I wore a smile. But behind closed doors, I cried and cried. At my children, I took out my spite, because their father was never around to help me fight. Daily I was battling and dealing with life's sorrow. Then along came a man who offered me a better tomorrow. This man was truly one of a kind, and honestly the way he spoke and smelled blew my mind. He took me places I have never been, and bought me things I have only dreamed. With him around, good things I was splurging. Hell yes, he spent the digits and was very encouraging. Life suddenly became aesthetic, and this man magnetic. Closer and closer I drew to him, because things before he came always seemed dim. He proposed a plan for a better life, and so for myself and children I made a choice. With determination to get me out of the slums, I ventured on a bus with him out of town. Holding my hands, he proclaimed his love, promising me loyalty and to never let me down. Since then, 2 months have passed and I am here, aghast. For all I could think about was my kids and the past. I was sold and branded 9. If only I could turn back the hands of time. My dreams and aspirations all thrown out of the door. Now battered and torn, hidden scars began to unfold. Dark and scary, life crashed it down like thunder. Why was I so stupid to make this blunder? With other young women, I dwell in a camp. Here we are always treated like tramps. The man who was kind do not give us a dime, but instead controls our bodies and minds. There is a mining area next door, but the workers there only focus on their chores. There are also people residing through the trails, but with all those trees around, I do not think they can hear. Or maybe they are scared and refuse to tell. The police would come and then leave, for their visits only pertain to collecting lump sums of cash and weed. Lost and overwhelmed, I am still locked in a cell. Can someone, anyone, please just get me out of this hell? Human trafficking is regarded as one of the most pressing human rights issues of our time. Safeguard yourself and others by reporting any suspicious activities to the Trafficking in Person hotline numbers on 227-4083 or cell phone number 623-5030.
Thank you very much, Impacts. That has introduced quite another perspective when we were discussing vulnerabilities. And in light of discussing vulnerabilities, to the panelists, in the goals and targets of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, UN member states pledged to end poverty and hunger in all forms and dimensions, and to ensure that all human beings can fulfill their potential in dignity and equality and a healthy environment. Is there a correlation between poverty reduction and a reduction in trafficking in persons?
Well, I think I don't mind going first on the panel, but looking at the topic for today, and the topic says perception and reality. And I think the perception is that only poor persons or persons experiencing poverty are trafficked. That's perception, but that's not the reality. The reality is that anyone can be trafficked. So therefore, poverty is just one of the areas of vulnerability for persons who are trafficked. So eradicating poverty would not necessarily eradicate human trafficking. It certainly may significantly address those victims whose needs or whose vulnerability is poverty, but it will not address all the areas of vulnerability for all victims.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wheeler. Ms. Borland, your hand is up.
Yes, thank you for the very complex question. Just to add on what was said by Ms. Wheeler, when we talk about prevention in human trafficking, we often think about videos and information campaigns, which are so important to raise awareness and help find these people so that we can identify them. But it's also important to know that prevention is working on these root causes, as you said, causes such as poverty. For migration, and echoing what was just said, it's not the poorest of the poor who manage to migrate trying to improve their lives. It's often someone who has a little more resources. We often hear victims of trafficking have borrowed money or sold assets in order to get the money together in order to make this journey to what they thought was a new job. So again, poverty is one of these risk factors, but it may be that there's inequality. It may be that there's violence in the home. It may be that there's no local job or education opportunity. So these root causes are very complex to work on. There are also issues such as access to services, opportunities for your children. So prevention is something we're all working on, and it is quite complex. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Ms. Borland. I believe, Jerry, your hand was up a short while ago.
Hi, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, a very complex question indeed. But what interested me or struck me when I was doing some research on this was a UN report from 2018, which advised that, and I don't like this phrase, the cost of a slave was its cheapest in the history of recording. And often this happens after times of sort of financial instability. After the financial instability, when recovery happens, sort of globalization, capitalism sort of extends the gap, the inequality gap between rich and poor, which drives this demand. And the poorer get poorer, and they feel the need to take these risks due to their vulnerability. So I do think there is a correlation between poverty and the increase in the prevalence of people being trafficked for the purposes of modern slavery. But it's much more than that. There's definitely other geopolitical considerations, country. For each national country, and for the multilateral organizations to consider.
Thank you very much, Jerry. And following on from that, while we're discussing vulnerabilities, which was really tied into persons' communities, are there places in the world where human trafficking is more prevalent? What are the drivers? And how does human trafficking also, I'd like to reintroduce the gender perspective, and how does human trafficking impact gender in particular?
Well, perhaps if I may, I'll start the round of responses. Thank you. I think an important comment in this is that numbers in trafficking are very misleading sometimes. We can only count the people we can find, although there are many efforts now to do estimations of prevalence. In fact, including in the region, some of this is happening. We're trying to understand that hidden population, but conceptually it's quite difficult. So we know who we are finding, which means when you look at numbers over time, I recently saw a slide for all of America, Latina, and the Caribbean. We looked at how many people have been identified over time, and we're not increasing very much in this region, which is a problem. We actually want to see more people identified. So the fact that you have more victims identified doesn't mean necessarily that the problem is worse. It means we're doing a better job finding the people that need help. So I just wanted to make that comment because it is indeed quite difficult to talk about actual prevalence or incidence of human trafficking. What we talk about is who we find, who we help, who we convict, these sorts of things. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I just want to, remind us that we're getting some very rich discussions around the whole issue of human trafficking. We had started early on about some of the links with slavery. And to remind participants, or those out there who may have joined us very recently, thank you so much for your participation. We are doing this in observance of International Day for the Abolition of Slavery. My question, why is it challenging to eradicate slavery, and what does state-sponsored slavery mean?
If I can perhaps answer?
Yes, please.
In terms of why is it challenging to eradicate slavery, I think, fundamentally it is a question of the very nature of mankind. Mankind thrives on control. We thrive on a sense of being in authority and usurping that authority to the very best of our advantage, financially and otherwise. So to the extent that as our human natures dictate, we want more money, we want more fame, we want more control, we're going to commit offenses. We use in a very broad conceptual framework. So that's, in my view, why slavery is being very difficult to eradicate. And of course, there are driving forces behind slavery and slave-like conditions: poverty, gender discrimination, unemployment, sense of disenfranchisement, geopolitical factors, civil war, unrest, etc. All of those are drivers which result in there being instances of slavery and trafficking in persons, more generally speaking. There's a second part of the question which you asked, which I think is instructive, which relates to and I hope that you can repeat it for me so that I can get the correct answer for you, Sharon. There's a second part of the question where you asked about what state-sponsored slavery looks like. Is that the question?
Yes, Jason, that was the question.
Right. So state-sponsored slavery would arise in circumstances in which the state, as an entity on international law, is complicit with activities related to slavery committed by non-state actors. All right. Now, it doesn't suggest that there are one or two members of the state's machinery who are involved in slave-like practices or complicit in it. It suggests that there is widespread complicity on the part of the state, because you can only bind the state on international law for conduct committed not just by a singular individual in the context of a crime against humanity as such, but for large numbers of its, the state machinery, police officers, immigration officers, having been complicit with the offense in question. One of the challenges which has arisen in the recent past is how to treat with circumstances in which non-state actors commit slave-like offenses. So companies operating, for example, in Canada, going to jurisdictions in, let's say, Africa, and using in the context of their supply chains, the services of trafficked victims or persons who are subject to forced labor. Now, there's a recent case, and I'm going to share it in a group in a while from now, which came out of Canada, out of the Supreme Court of Canada in February of this year, which explicitly creates a new cause of action whereby the state in question would hold multilateral organizations, which traditionally have not been held liable for trafficking in persons and slavery, for offenses which they commit not in their home jurisdiction, but overseas. All right. So I think that is a brilliant development for international law, because it means then that not only are host states taking action against companies in particular that commit slave-like offenses, but also home countries, so countries from which investors come, they are beginning to recognize that, listen, we have a role to play as well in preventing and combating trafficking in persons and slave-like practices.
Thank you, Jason. Ms. Wheeler, you care to respond?
Yes, certainly. I will respond to the first question. Why is it challenging to eradicate slavery? Now, based on all the debates that went before, slavery, human trafficking, modern day slavery, I'm assuming that we understand what we're speaking about when we say slavery. But the first thing we have to do as countries is to admit and recognize that we have a problem. It may sound very simple, But there are some countries that don't recognize that they have a problem, that don't admit that there is a human trafficking situation or slavery or modern slavery situation existing in their country. And we know that human trafficking exists all over the world. Most countries, if not all countries, have some form of human trafficking taking place. But have all countries come to that state of recognizing we have a problem? First of all, like a drug addict, like any person who's addicted to anything, you have a problem. Okay, once you have a problem, let's deal with it. Human trafficking is demand driven. And I always say this in my forum, it's a business model, it's a business model, it's a business model. It's the second or third largest criminal enterprise in the world. It has probably gone higher than that since then. But it is a business model. And if there is a demand, there will always be a ready supply, and there will always be persons and criminal enterprises and corrupt officials willing to supply for that demand. So if the demand is for sexual services, commercial sexual services, then there are persons who will supply that. If the demand is for cheap labor, there are persons or agencies that will supply that and will provide it. So it's a, I mean, to me, it's a simple 1, 2, 3, 4 way of understanding how to treat with it. How can we eradicate it? Well, if we want to go back to the Bible days and say that there was slavery in the Bible days, how did Moses deliver the children of Israel out of Egypt? And I'll leave that question right there for those who wish to explore that option. But it is, some say, it is a spiritual problem and it needs to be addressed spiritually first of all, and then we can do all the other things to treat with responding to it, right? But let's look at Moses as an example. That's in the history books. He was successful, and so maybe we can look at what he did.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wheeler. Ms. Borland, you care to respond?
Yes, thank you. As we're talking about the responsibilities of states and all of the things which we can find in the international humanitarian law, in Palermo Protocol, we also are talking about protecting workers. So if we have better standards for our workers in general, that helps respond to human trafficking. It helps us find people in exploitation, as it also helps prevent exploitation of workers. If we protect migrants, the same. We know migrants are at risk, especially those who do not have documents or are illegal in our countries. The same is for gender-based violence and women and girls. So those are things we can work on structurally from the state. But also I want to echo the responsibility of employers and consumers. And I think this is a really important point. Employers have a lot to stand up to do more and more and more to ensure that there are no goods or services produced in slave-like conditions and human trafficking in their supply chains. And there are examples of legislation in different parts of the world. And us as consumers, we can choose to try to buy or use services that we know are fighting the good fight against human trafficking. So for example, hotels that have zero tolerance of sexual exploitation of children, for example. So there are examples out there of how both consumers and employers can fight against this. And finally, there are schemes, for example, of ensuring ethical recruitment of workers, because we know that traffickers trick people into giving them money for these jobs. You know, they charge fees, they create debts for their travel. And there are ethical recruitment frameworks out there. One is called IRIS, I-R-I-S, which IOM is involved in, where we have principles that no worker should be paying recruitment fees. This should be absorbed by the employer. And that's a way to prevent people getting tricked into debt bondage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Borland. And following on from that, we've discussed this slavery in the state. Whose responsibility is it to end slavery? And what are some common tactics and strategies that can be used to combat modern day slavery, as we've been discussing earlier on?
If you'd permit me to go.
Yes, please.
Chair.
Yes, please.
Right. So whose responsibility is it? We are all responsible. We are all responsible, whether we work in the government, whether we work in an NGO, whether we belong to a church or faith-based organization, whether we are students in school, wherever we are, whoever we are all responsible, because we are responsible for the countries and the states that we live in. So I appreciate the comment that was made by, I think, Chris Chinapu in the chat box, where he said it's a multi-agency and a multi-stakeholder, multi-dimensional approach and a multi-dimensional response ought to be adopted to treat with the issue of human trafficking. We have the challenges of resources in many of our countries, particularly now in the current situation, and no one state or no one agency has the solution by itself. We need to work together, partner, cooperate, corroborate with each other, and with states from country to country. Even within the CARICOM region, we can cooperate from state to state to help to prevent it, number one, and also to penalize and to assist in the penalizing of actual cases that we get. So I would say in a nutshell that we are all responsible. We are all responsible.
Thank you so much for that. Any further comments from our panelists on this? Okay, having said that,
I think Mr. Cassidy, Sharon, I think Mr. Cassidy wants to say something.
Okay, Jerry.
Jerry.
Just to endorse what my colleagues have said, it is everyone's responsibility, from the person in the street to the international organisations. I was quite encouraged by Jason's identification of the international law, which shares, like two sovereign states identifying, issues with supply chains. So from that level to local education about identification, to the frontline responders and to local services, to government organisations, it's a huge task, but it's everyone's responsibility.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Again, to those persons who may have joined us late, this was put on the agenda in observance of the International Day for the Abolition of Slavery. We've been discussing in the main some of the parallels between slavery and human trafficking. Given that, and I'd like to pose this question to all the panelists, can you share some acceptable practices and lessons learned on human trafficking? Ms. Bolan, please.
Certainly. I think there are many, and it's a very broad question, but I'll share one that I think is very important. When we started studying the impact of trafficking on the people who live through this, we learned how much damage it does to physical and mental health of the people, and that when someone is rescued or escapes from the situation, they really need some time to recover. So there is a good practice called a reflection period, which is where states and their partners protect the person and give them services and allow them a period of time under which they do not have to make big decisions about whether they formally place charges against the criminals who've hurt them, whether they return home to their country if they're an international victim. These sorts of big decisions that someone has to make shortly after surviving the situation. They go through a reflection period where they receive shelter and care and medical assistance and guidance and legal counseling and all the sorts of things they need, so that when they are ready, they are able to make those decisions. And this has been shown to improve cooperation with law enforcement. People are more likely to decide that, yes, they want to press charges, that they feel safe enough to do so. So the reflection period is an example of a good practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bolan. Any of the other panelists?
Yes, lesson one. The distance perpetrators would go to try to prevent prosecution. The type of resources they would invest into the situation, in preventing prosecution. So that sometimes makes it much more difficult to prosecute these perpetrators. Yes, I endorse what my previous speaker said with regard to the victim, but I speak on the side of the perpetrators with regard to the length they would go at to try to prevent prosecution.
Thank you so much for that. Any further perspectives from our panelists?
Yep, Sharon, just quickly from the UK, we have our national referral mechanism and competent single authority, or single competent authority that deals with potential victims. And we've now got language and culturally appropriate support mechanisms for said victims. So we try and aid the sort of reflection period and the progression through language and culturally appropriate support.
Thank you very much. Any other panelists dealing with this question before we introduce some closing remarks?
Yes, I want to fully agree with Rosalind and my colleague Jerry from the UK, the reflection period, yes, I fully endorse and I agree with it. I wish and hope that we could have that implemented in Trinidad. Let's see how things go with that. But two other best practices I think that would be useful is when you have a unit or an agency or a department or persons who are dedicated full-time towards treating with the issue of human trafficking in your country. The reason being it's very difficult when you have persons operating on a part-time basis or persons who have other jobs to do, and maybe 2% or 10% of their time is towards the state response. It really helps when the country has that unit or that staff, that team of persons who can really focus on the issue of human trafficking and really be able to coordinate and assist in providing a proper state response to the issue. That's one suggestion. The other suggestion is also the relationship with the media. The topic we have here today is hidden truth, perception, and reality. And I have found that we can use the media to our advantage to really put the truth and the facts out there with respect to human trafficking. That means having a really positive and a good relationship with media personnel and media houses so that they can get the message out there about what human trafficking is and so that they can warn persons about the red flags and the indicators of human trafficking, and persons can know who they can go to and who they can report issues to. The media will also highlight the work that the state agencies and other agencies in the country are doing to treat with and to respond to human trafficking. And we have found them in our past, in our history in the counter-trafficking unit to be very, very useful and strong allies in our fight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any further contributions from the panelists on this specific question before we begin to address closing remarks? Okay. It has been a wonderful engagement with our panelists, and I would like to congratulate all for the sterling contributions that were made so far. Certainly, it was instructive for myself as the moderator, and I'm certain those sentiments are expressed by all the participants from our pool, our virtual pool. In terms of closing remarks, I would just like to ask Lizette if she could lead us off with some closing remarks. Any last words? Thank you. She's still here?
Yes, she is. Lizette. Lourdes had to leave, so I think she said Lizette will be here. So
okay, good.
Okay, you could go to Alana then. Thanks.
All right, Alana, please. Any closing remarks, last words?
Yes, just to say thank you to the CARICOM Impacts on behalf of the Ministry of National Security, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Counter-Trafficking Unit. I would just like to thank CARICOM Impacts for allowing us and inviting us to be a part of this panel discussion. I think it was an excellent topic, very debatable topic. I'm really looking forward to seeing CARICOM play a more significant role in rendering support to the CARICOM countries in respect to our response to human trafficking and the issue of migration and human trafficking, which is becoming more and more of a challenge in many of our countries. I would also like to say thank you to all the panelists who have been excellent and who have brought a really good balance to the topic, the practitioners, the lawyers, and the international experts that have been on the panel. I thank you so much for sharing the platform or sharing the table and allowing me to share this table with you virtually. And I also want to say thank you to the participants who are from all over. I'm seeing so many familiar names as participants, and just thank you for really supporting this effort and being a part. I want to encourage each person who was part of today's session to really consider your role as an individual and your agency's role in responding to human trafficking. And always remember that the victim is at the center of our response. The victim is at the center of our response. And we always seek to adopt a victim-centered approach. I do want to wish you all a very Merry Christmas. We have a Christmas with a difference this year. In my own office, we will be having a virtual lunch, Christmas lunch. So I am looking forward to having that with the staff and the persons under my leadership. So I wish you all God's blessings and have a wonderful Merry Christmas.
Thank you very much, Alana. Jerry, could you care to just give us a brief, closing remarks and some final perspectives?
Yeah, thank you, Sherman. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to take part today. Although my expertise is immigration sort of crime overall, it does, of course, form a part of modern slavery, human trafficking. So it was very interesting to hear my colleagues' perceptions today. I learned as much as anyone else today. Despite the different perceptions that we all may have regarding modern slavery, it's clear that we all recognise how abhorrent the crime is, yeah, and how prevalent actually the crime is. But it's also very encouraging to see the passion and the expertise that's in the region and the support that we get from our international partners. So that's very encouraging. And like Alana, I would like to encourage all the participants today to go back and reflect. There are many resources there, and I've learned that in the past week just as much. And there's loads of information there to help develop and support so that we can combat this crime. So again, thank you very much. It's been most interesting, and like Alana, to everyone, I would like to wish you all a safe and happy Christmas.
Thank you very much, Jerry. I'd now invite ESP Ellis to give us some, closing remarks and some final perspectives.
Yeah, good morning again. I want to thank Impact on behalf of the Ministry of National Security, Antigua and Barbuda, for having us participated in this real informative program. I must say that interesting discussion, and what I can assure you that we will continue to do our best to stamp out this heinous crime of human trafficking. Also, I heard during the discussion pertaining to the trial of cases. What I would hope to see in the near future is that we have some speedy trial with regard to human trafficking, because the discussion is that most of the time we lose those victims in giving evidence. So I know this is something to do with the individual government, but speedy trial is of great importance to us. So once again, thanks for having us.
Thank you so very much. And Rosalind?
Oh, sorry.
Please go ahead. Yes, Lizette, you're most welcome. Please.
Oh, thank you so much. Sorry, I was having issues with thank you. I was having issues with my audio earlier, and that's why I couldn't, you guys couldn't hear me. I just wanted to say thank you to all of you, to CARICOM Impacts, on behalf of UNODC for the invitation for this panel. My colleague Lourdes had to leave because she's getting married tomorrow, and an appointment with the judge came up and she had to run. But I am here just to thank you on behalf of UNODC and on behalf of Lourdes as well. As many of you may already know, we also have a project right now that's in the Caribbean, so we're very excited to be part of this conversation and wish everyone a happy holidays, and then just count with UNODC and our support with anything that we can help. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure. And Miss Rosalind, could you bring us some closing remarks?
Of course, my pleasure. Thank you so much to CARICOM Impacts for allowing me to participate on behalf of IOM. It's really a pleasure to join these conversations with all of the experts in the Caribbean. I really appreciate the opportunity. I also want to thank everyone for for listening and for all the work that you're doing, especially specialized police, prosecutors, and those who are assisting victims of trafficking. And as a final remark, just let's take care of each other as we're going through this pandemic and things are still a little bit rough. I think be careful with the offers you accept. And if you hear of other people who are considering moving in a way that sounds scary, invite them to ask questions and to be careful before they migrate somewhere else. Everyone, thank you. Please take care and happy holidays.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. Two of our panelists, Mr. Daniel Griffith and Mr. Jason Haynes, unfortunately had to leave before we got into this part, but of course we were assured of their well wishes towards the panel, and they also apologized for having to leave early. Impacts, I suppose thanks goes out to you, and I now pass the mic back over to you in the personage of Mr. Rufus Ferdinand, the Deputy Chief Operations Officer at Impacts JRCC, to do some final wrap-ups. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, we have heard from our esteemed panel of experts here today that human trafficking is a challenge of extraordinary proportions. On a yearly basis, unscrupulous characters and transnational organized crime groups earns billions of dollars running human trafficking networks. Families around the globe suffer the misery of this humiliating and degrading crime. Children, women, migrants, refugees, and internally displaced persons are particularly vulnerable to human trafficking. As law enforcement practitioners and border security personnel, we have an innate responsibility to enforce the law and pursue all measures to dismantle human trafficking organizations and to bring those who are involved and responsible to justice. Our member states have all implemented legislation criminalizing all forms of human trafficking, providing law enforcement practitioners a framework and a platform that can protect our children, women, migrants, and those who are displaced. Human trafficking is also an issue of economic and social development. However, this crime is not simply the symptoms of a fragile or poor country. It occurs in every region, irrespective of the size of the GDP. Due to the multifaceted nature of human trafficking and its close connections with other transnational organized crime issues, no country is capable of combating this transnational threat on its own. This global threat, therefore, requires coordinated and meaningful responses at all levels, local, regional, and international. As a region, our approach to combat such criminal activity needs to be one that is inclusive and involves the participation of all sectors. There is a need to have proper balance and progressive and proactive approach so law practitioners can effectively combat the market forces driving human trafficking into many destination countries. In support of this approach, CARICOM Impacts will continue to forge partnership with regional and international organizations such as IOM, UNHCR, UNODC. We will implement programs that will empower key groups within our society, particularly women, young people, and the private sector. Colleagues, we need to ensure that we provide the support at all levels to those vulnerable groups and those who are victims of human trafficking. The physical, psychological, and economic violence that accompanies such crime are long-lasting if proper support mechanisms are not in place or available at the national level. We will continue to work with criminal justice systems to sensitize and promote sensitivity and understanding of such violent crimes and how it targets women and vulnerable persons. Complementing this approach, we will continue to design advocacy campaigns capable of educating people about human trafficking and its violence. We all will agree that all activities must be based on strong political commitments, both at the regional and international level, as well as an interagency and multi-stakeholder strategy. There has been significant progress through the work of the United Nations and interagency coordination groups and global initiatives to fight human trafficking. But as a region, we must work harder and as a team. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the legislative instruments, we have the partnership, we know the targeting system, we have the targeting systems, and we have APIS, which is being manned by one of CARICOM Impact's agencies, which assists in identifying persons who are involved or persons who have been trafficked within CARICOM member states or persons who are suspected to be involved in such criminal activities. We know the MOs of those involved in such criminal activities, and we know that we have an obligation that we need to protect those vulnerable victims or those persons who have been exploited. Let us continue the fight and bring those who are involved in these unscrupulous and shameful crime to justice. I know our region and the hearts and souls of those who serve at all levels. We can be that change, and hope that those who have given up on life in whatever form or fashion, let us continue to align our national strategies and vision to show support for the victim of human trafficking. In closing, I would like to say a special thank you to our moderator, Sherwin, our panelists, and those who worked tirelessly to make this webinar possible. Those who join us via Facebook and social media platforms, other social media platforms, or participants, trust that the various insights and interventions made and shared here today added to the wealth of knowledge on the subject and will further assist and enhance in the performance of your duties and mandate at all levels. I thank you. Season's greeting to all. May God bless you. Back to you, moderator.
Yes, one moment.
Over 20.9 million men, women, and children are victims of human trafficking. But do you know what human trafficking actually is? In a small sleepy town, people are dreaming. But not everyone's dreams will come true. Human traffickers prey on people's dreams and lure them away for their own benefit. How do they do this? Human trafficking doesn't happen all of a sudden. It's a process. First, traffickers act. This includes recruiting victims, transporting them to the place where they'll be exploited, hiding them from authorities, and receiving victims from other traffickers. So why don't the victims run away or say no? Because traffickers use different means. This includes threatening or forcing victims to do what they want, abducting or deceiving the victims, and abusing power. Sometimes traffickers promise small payments or benefits to get the victim to cooperate. And why are the traffickers doing this? The purpose of trafficking is exploitation. Traffickers take advantage of victims for their own profit or benefit. This is human trafficking. This man's neighbor tells him that he has a great job for him on a very safe construction site and that he'll be paid a lot of money. With more money, he can make his dreams come true. He agrees to take the job. A few days later, the neighbor's friend picks him up and they drive to the construction site. It's a very long way from his home. This man is put to work immediately without any training or protective equipment, without enough to eat or drink, and with very few breaks. After many months, he's only been paid a fraction of what he was promised. He knows he's been tricked, but he doesn't have enough money to get home. This man is a victim of human trafficking. He was recruited by his neighbor and tricked into thinking he was going to work at a safe construction site for fair pay. Instead, he was forced to work long hours in unsafe conditions for almost no money, while others benefited from his exploitation. One day, while looking for jobs online, this woman comes across an opportunity to work in a restaurant in a big city. Her application is successful, and her new employer arranges for her travel there. She is met at the airport and driven to a part of the city that looks nothing like she expected. The car pulls up to a building. The door is shut and locked behind her. She is made to perform sex acts against her will. She is trapped. This woman is a victim of human trafficking. She was transported by a trafficker from the airport to the location of the job. When she arrived at the location and realized it was not the restaurant job she was expecting, the traffickers used force to keep her there. She was then exploited for forced sex work. This 14-year-old boy on school break is approached on the street by a woman who looks trustworthy. She tells him that she needs workers at her factory, and she promises him lots of money. He brings her to meet his parents. They are so happy for him. He'll now be able to save money for school. The woman drives him to the next town. They pull up to an old building. There is someone waiting for him. As he is led inside, the nice lady drives off. The factory isn't anything like she described. There are lots of people working, including many children. He works all day, and after just a few hours of sleep, he starts again. He is sad. This isn't what he expected. He misses his family. After weeks, he still hasn't received any salary or been allowed to contact them. He is trapped. This boy is a victim of human trafficking. He was tricked by the woman who recruited him on the street. He was then received by a trafficker when he arrived at the factory and exploited by being forced to sew clothing. For anyone under the age of 18, only the act and purpose matter for it to legally be a case of human trafficking. Understanding that human trafficking doesn't happen all at once, but instead is a process of act, means, and purpose, helps us better identify victims and trafficking trends. People everywhere are dreaming and looking for opportunities to make those dreams come true. Human trafficking is happening all around us. Will you recognize it when you see it? To learn more, visit iomx.org.
Thank you, Impacts. In closing, I just want to thank you guys very much for the support. Remind us that on the 2nd of December, 1949, the United Nations Convention for the Suppression of Trafficking in Persons and the Exploitation of the Prostitution of Others was adopted by the General Assembly. And this is seen as the first convention on combating human trafficking. The 2nd of December is now observed as the International Day for the Abolition of Slavery. Through Impacts, the region was able to deliver this very informative webinar, for which we are extremely grateful: Hidden Truths, Perceptions, and Realities of Modern-Day Slavery in the Caribbean. Do have a safe and enjoyable weekend and Christmas season, and thank you all for your participation.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye,
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Many thanks, everyone, and all the best for this season.
Goodbye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Yeah, just wrapping up our next meeting there. Is our next